Just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. There we go. Should be okay and happy now. All righty, y'all. So, did we get to talk about mercantilism or the taxes and play taxman or anything? Did we get that far?
No.
No, we did not. Okay. Just trying to find where we got in here. Did we talk about the slippery slope argument? Did we get that far?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so remember, y'all, to us it might seem kind of weird that Americans, our colonists, were worried about a small tax, but in their mind, the small tax constituted a slippery slope. If you let the British pass this tax without allowing representation of Americans in Parliament, the British are going to take it further and further. And as we said, Sam Adams is going to take it all the way from, they're limiting our trade, and suddenly we wake up one morning and we're slaves. Okay, now, so the big problem that the British faced would be whether, how to pay for all of these new revenues. And what they chose to do, the debt had doubled. And so who's going to pay for the war? Who's going to pay for the soldiers who are over here to keep the Indians and the colonials from fighting? Who's going to pay for all that? Well, here we hear the Beatles to that.
It's 1/19.
Now, nobody, including the Beatles, liked the taxman, right? As the Beatles became wealthier and wealthier, they saw more and more of their income disappearing, right? And they would have become what we call tax exiles. John Lennon did move over here ultimately, but you see other rock stars who do that. They flee away from those high taxes. Now, King George, you see here saying, look, the cost of beating the French has doubled our national debt, which was true. Who's going to pay it? Englishmen were already overtaxed in his mind at 20%. And remember, Englishmen could vote for people in Parliament. Americans couldn't. Now, George Grenville, who was prime minister for part of this period, he argues that it's the colonists who should do this. And remember, y'all, we talked a lot about how the French-Indian War caused some really bad feelings between the two, okay? See if can I get rid of this stupid thing here? Yes, hopefully. Hide myself. Okay, they had, the colonists had already had to pay, they had already smuggled a lot. They didn't like this war. The British thought they fought this war for us, and we just were ungrateful. So they thought in their mind it was fair for Americans to do it. So the Brits are going to come up with some taxes. Now, the page that was given to you guys is going to have a series of laws. Now, one of these laws that's on your chart is called the Navigation Acts. Notice I did not put a date on the Navigation Acts because there's quite a few of these and they occur over a lot of years. Now, the Navigation Acts were relatively accepted by the colonists because they weren't necessarily about generating money. They were more about regulating trade, which, the colonists didn't like, but hey. Now, on the paper that I gave you on the notes, one of the questions I asked towards the bottom is, why did the colonists not oppose the Navigation Acts earlier? Well, think about it, y'all. I know this today. You guys were given these badges, right? You and I don't like badges. I hate them, but sadly, as part of our safety, this is something that's happening in most businesses you guys will work for, have these kind of things. Now, what if they didn't enforce these at all? No one ever got in trouble. Or if you did get caught not having your ID badge, nobody did anything about it. Would it really bug you that we had rules about badges? No, because it's not being enforced. Now, if on the other hand, every time a teacher saw you without an ID badge, you got written up for like Saturday detention, well, man, suddenly the badge issue would become a thing. So the main reason we colonists were not too upset about the Navigation Acts is they weren't really very enforced. And if indeed you did get caught, what we tended to do was we ignored these laws. We just ignored them, like a lot of students ignored, wearing ID badges, or will ignore. All right. Another thing, by the way, the Navigation Acts did is, remember, they're part of mercantilism. What is mercantilism? It's this idea that you want to keep the gold and silver in the mother country. You want to maximize your exports, minimize your imports. In other words, you want people sending gold and silver to you without you having to send much of that gold and silver back out to them. You want to maximize your gold, all right? So one of the things was, if they weren't going to trade with the British, they still had to go through Britain. So let's say I want to sell stuff to France. I have to use British ships and British crews, which fortunately included Americans in those days. But I would have to stop in Britain. Britain would tax the items on there, so they would get a chunk of that money, and then I could take it on to France. In a way, it's kind of like saying who your friends and girlfriends can be, and we did not like that. So at first, we ignored these laws, and we smuggled. Now, let's say if you got caught smuggling, maybe you're bringing in Dutch tea, and you're not paying any fees. You're not going through Britain with the Dutch tea. What would happen is you would pay off an official. You would give him or her some either money or give them the goods, and that person would let you bring it ashore. Now, in the rare chance that perhaps you actually got caught and the official couldn't be bribed and it went to trial, guess what? The jury was willing to usually let you off. Remember, a jury is a jury of your peers. It's a very, very important tradition that we have going back to 1215 to the Magna Carta. So even then, it was old. So you paid off officials. The juries went easy on you. So to be honest, it wasn't that big a deal. All right. Now, John Hancock, shown here, became rich by smuggling. In fact, he was one of the richest people, if not the richest, in the colonies. Later famous for what? Where does that signature come from, y'all? Declaration of Independence. Remember, his signature is like 3 or 4 times as big as everybody else's, because he said he wanted the king to be able to read it without his spectacles. So this is a guy who made his money smuggling. Now, I'm not talking about smuggling drugs or something bad. I'm talking about like smuggling tea or cloth or things like that they didn't want to go through Britain and have to pay the taxes. So he's a smuggler. There we go. All right. Now, on your chart, y'all, the first act that we have a date for and one that you need to know is called the Sugar Act. Now, in truth, there had already been Sugar and Molasses Acts passed, but like the Navigation Acts, they had not been that enforced. And so the colonists didn't really mind. But things changed with the 1764 Sugar Act on sugar and molasses. Now, today, there's all kinds of sugar substitutes. Today, most of us don't use molasses very much. But in those days, y'all, molasses was a key component of making rum, right? And rum was one of the most popular adult beverages they had at the time. So what this tax did is, if I'm trying to bring in sugar or I'm trying to bring in molasses into the colonies, I'm going to be charged a tax before I bring it ashore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass that tax on in the form of a higher price when I sell it. So when you and I buy that good, either sugar or we buy rum or whatever, or maybe molasses, we're going to notice the price is higher. But we're not going to see directly that it's a tax. This is what's known as an indirect tax. Now, when I lived in Canada as a kid, one of the many places we lived, I thought it was kind of interesting because prices in Canada, at least when I lived there, the price you saw was the price. It wasn't the price plus tax. You guys know how it is here. If something's $5 and you put $5 on the table, they're going to look at you kind of strange and say, it's 41 more cents for tax and that kind of thing. But the tax was kind of hidden in the form of a higher price. You and I see this today. You guys hopefully aren't buying cigarettes or alcohol, but alcohol and cigarettes are much more expensive than they should be. Why? Because we tax the heck out of them. I'm not saying I disagree. I don't like either product, but I'm just saying the fact that we tax those things because we know we can. You can raise the tax on cigarettes. Are people still going to buy them? Yeah. You can raise the tax on alcohol. Are people still going to buy it? Yeah. Now you have to be careful. If you raise it too high, people are going to start smuggling it, making it illegally or whatever. So it's a fine kind of line that we've learned. But in most things in the United States, y'all, when you and I buy it, they tell us the price and then the tax is extra. It is a direct tax. This is what we call indirect. Now, that is definitely an economic reason for the revolution. People don't like paying taxes, but there's more to it than just the extra few cents on sugar and on booze. One of the problems is now the British would enforce this, and if you got caught doing this, y'all, you went not to a court with the jury of your peers, but an admiralty court. Now, an admiralty court had British judges who were paid by the British Crown. In other words, we had no control over these people. Also, because they weren't a jury of our peers who tended to be friendlier to us, often letting us off, maybe they were even our customers, we did not have that anymore. And more people began getting arrested for smuggling and going to jail for smuggling. They even started setting up sort of a rat line where you could let an official know that somebody was a smuggler, and you could actually get, some money or even part of the stuff they were smuggling in as payment for ratting somebody out. Now, so what was the colonial reaction to it? Well, protest, right? But nothing like would come a couple of years, or would come the very next year. But we do have a famous phrase that comes out of this, and it is taxation without representation is tyranny. You guys will see that and hear that ad nauseum. Taxation without representation is tyranny. And of course, as this other gentleman is saying, so are trials without jury. So remember, y'all, this revolution, yeah, it's about economics, but it's also about political rights. One of our sacred rights is going to be trials by jury. And even in the Declaration, when we're listing what we call our grievances, we make a big point in saying that the government has, in some cases, deprived us of our right to trial by juries. It's a sacred right, y'all. It is in our Constitution's Bill of Rights today. So many things, y'all, when we write our Constitution, they are a direct response to what we viewed as tyrannical actions on the part of the president.
Our sugar, they're smuggling sugar. I'll make it cheap.
They actually lowered the tax that had been on sugar already, but they started enforcing it more. Man, wasn't that awesome? You'll never forget the sugar tax. Now we come to the Currency Act, and I can't make this 5-pound note go away. Now, paper money, y'all, just kind of curious. Y'all think paper money is much longer for the world? I mean, y'all ever turn down when somebody offers you paper money, like, hey, man, I don't take that anymore? Y'all, like, if I offered y'all a $100 bill, would you turn it away? No, right? But have you guys noticed that there are some places now that don't take cash? Like, when I go to AMC over here, and I try to give them cash, they're like, oh, no. It's got to be credit card. I guess they don't want to handle dirty bills because, bills have all kinds of germs or something on them. It's kind of weird. But, more and more, we're going digital, right? Now, paper money took a long time before people got used to it. What did people use before paper money? Coins. Now, today, if I offered you a bunch of coins, you might take it, but you wouldn't be really happy, right? It's heavy and all of that. And to be honest, our coins today don't have a whole lot of intrinsic worth. In other words, you could melt down a quarter And I don't know how much silver you're going to get out of it, if any, right? But back in the day, coins were gold. They were silver. They were copper. They had value. And of course, the British wanted them. Remember, mercantilism was all about getting as much gold and silver as you could and keeping it. Now, the colonists pretty much were required through the Navigation Acts to buy British. They would sell their stuff to the British, and then the British would buy stuff or would sell them manufactured goods. But the trouble is, y'all, it was kind of one-sided. The colonists were buying a lot more stuff from the British than the British were buying back from the colonists. So it wasn't like we send over 1,000 pounds and they buy 1,000 pounds back. There was a real trade deficit is the term that we would use today. We're buying a lot more from them than they're from us. Kind of like what China is today, right? We buy a lot more from China than China buys from us. So colonists began, y'all, to start running out of money. So kind of understand the background to the British law, the Currency Act. And this definitely is an economic cause. Colonists were buying a lot more from the British than vice versa. And like you see one of the coins back from the day, they weren't really nice like our coins today. They were pretty rough, right? So what this starts to do is it leads to a coin currency shortage. Okay, we begin to run out of specie, people call it. There's a shortage of gold and silver out there. And so the colonists, y'all, begin the practice of printing paper money, a lot of paper money. Now, you and I today, we're not nervous about paper money. We're used to it. People, especially businesses, were very nervous about paper money. In this case, this is issued by the Virginia James River Bank. It is number 52 out of 5,193 notes done. They literally wrote that on it, y'all, and each note was signed by the banker and the treasurer. Imagine what that was like. The British, y'all, they didn't like this money being printed. And sure as you know what, they did not want to accept paper money. And another thing the colonists were doing that's going to tick off the British, y'all, is it was fairly easy to declare bankruptcy. Now, bankruptcy can be personal. You got so many credit card bills, there's just no way you're going to be able to pay it. So what happens? Well, you might lose your house, your house, your car, whatever. And then they would sell that, and then they would pay off your creditors, and then you have to start all over again. If you're a business, they take what they call your assets. So let's say Mr. D has been opening up his Italican fusion restaurant, Italian food mixed with Mexican food, right? And man, you know, I get about $1 million in debt, paying workers and paying, you know, for all the ingredients, and I just don't have much money at all. And finally, I have to declare bankruptcy. Well, they'll look and they'll say, well, you got about $100,000 in equipment here at your restaurant, maybe the building or whatever. We're going to take that, and then we'll pay off your creditors, maybe 10 cents on the dollar. So if I owe some dude $10,000, he might get $1,000, and then I'm free, right? The guy doesn't get his money, but I'm free, and maybe in the future sometime I can try to have another business or something. Well, the colonists, y'all, were declaring bankruptcy way too much for the British. So the British respond to our printing of money, right? We've got lots of printed money there. The British respond, y'all, by passing this law that keeps the colonies from printing money. Sorry, this 5-pound note is blocking that. But the Currency Act forbid the colonists from printing money, paper money, and it also, y'all, tighten the bankruptcy law. It wasn't as easy to declare bankruptcy and write off your debts, mainly to the British, and leave them holding the bag. So this is definitely an economic thing. And you can kind of understand where the British are coming from, but at the same time, the Americans got to have money to buy and sell and trade stuff with each other. So it's a Currency Act. Probably not asked a whole lot on the AP test, but if you want an economic reason for the revolution, you could point this one out. British didn't let us print money. They tightened bankruptcy laws. We were not happy about that at all. Now, the next thing that comes is the Stamp Act. Now, if you guys remember anything in May when you take your AP test, you need to remember the Stamp Act. It is by far, until the Coercive Acts, the worst of the British actions. 1765, the Stamp Act. Now, what it did was it required all publications, all official documents, y'all, to actually have a stamp that you had to buy for. So you tick off newspaper publishers because every newspaper, y'all, had to have a stamp added to it, and you paid for that stamp. Every official document, you get married, you get divorced, you graduate from school, even playing cards, y'all, had to have that on dice that you bought, had to have a stamp of some sort. They tried to get it everybody. Now, what's different about this than the sugar tax is this is a direct tax. In other words, you know the price of something you're buying, but then boom, here's an extra 2 cents for the tax. And this angered Americans. Now, the British couldn't understand why the Americans were upset. The British already had a stamp tax on their own citizens, so they didn't think Americans would mind. But the difference is British citizens had the right to elect and send their own people to Parliament. We couldn't do that. So this was not a tax that we had created. It was a tax imposed on us. Now, we had friends in Parliament. One of them was a guy by the name of Isaac Barr, or Barre. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. But anyway, he comes up with this quote, and Americans will definitely embrace part of this. He says, Americans are sons of liberty, and they won't surrender their rights without a fight. And as it says, he proved to be very right. So the Stamp Act, y'all, there are going to be several colonial actions you guys need to know. One of the first things that will come up, y'all, come back to that, is sorry about that, y'all, is going to be the Stamp Act Congress. Now, the Stamp Act Congress is going to be where the colonists will send representatives to New York, just as they had done to try to come up with the Albany Plan at the Albany Congress. But remember, that was to try to keep the Indians neutral, or at least the Iroquois neutral, or even on our side, and to kind of come up with some common defense. This was purely, y'all, trying to come up with a solution to fight this tax. Later, we'll have a Continental Congress and a Second Continental Congress. But this is the first of the pre-revolutionary Congresses. And like I said, in some way kind of modeled on the Albany Plan or Albany Congress, but this was a big deal. So how are they going to fight this tax? They are going to boycott all British goods. They're going to list things and say, we're not going to buy these. They're going to hit the British in the pocketbook. Virginia also writes what are known as the Virginia Resolves. We hear for the first time a man's name by the name of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is a real firebrand, man. He has fire like coming out of his mouth when he talks, and he even threatens the king, y'all. He says, let King George remember the fate of Caesar and Charles I. Well, what happened to Caesar, y'all? What happened to Julius Caesar, y'all, man? Ides of March? Psycho? He got stabbed multiple times in the Senate, including one by one of his best friends, Brutus. Charles I had his head cut off by the British. British don't tend to cut off heads of their kings, y'all. They've only done it once. So he's basically saying, King George, remember what happened to Caesar. Remember what happened to Charles I. You could be next if you keep doing this. Pretty strong words. Now, I want to go back here, though, and talk about the Sons of Liberty. Now, on your handout, I ask about the Sons of Liberty as well as the Daughters of Liberty. AP loves to ask y'all about the role women play in historical events. How did this impact them? What role did they play? Now, the Sons of Liberty obviously were men. They resisted sometimes peacefully by writing pamphlets, okay, by distributing, signs and putting signs up opposing the British and this tax. But they also used some pretty strong intimidation. And to me, it's more than intimidation. It almost verges on terrorism. Now, so we see a tax seller, a stamp seller here. He sells the stamps that you have to put on your legal documents. Notice one guy is holding a bucket of tar, one is holding feathers. The threat is, of course, tarring and feathering. Now, the Daughters of Liberty, y'all, these were women who also supported punishing the British for the Stamp Act. Now, rather than using violence, they chose to use boycotts and somewhat more like peer pressure. Women might get together and spin cloth, make their own cloth so they wouldn't be buying it from the British. They might even have what were called sewing or quilting or spinning bees, where they would get together, bunches of them, and make their own cloth and maybe share with each other and that kind of thing. So that's an important role that they played. Now, also, what women sometimes did, I've heard, is they were sort of the enforcers of the boycott. Since women tended to be more often the people that did the shopping, they would intimidate, just as women might, maybe not by violence, but by shunning people or shaming other women who would not participate. Like, why are you buying that British cloth? You shouldn't be buying that British cloth. And things like that. So this was ways that they went about it. Now, I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit here. We talked about the Stamp Act Congress. Now let's come to the Sons of Liberty. Now, the leaders of the Sons of Liberty was this guy, right? This is Samuel Adams, who I have as a bobblehead here, although he's a lot skinnier than I remember him. But anyway, Samuel Adams, y'all, had been a maltster. That is a guy who makes the malt that from the barley that is used to make beer. You hear people claiming today, mainly the people that make Sam Adams beer, that he was a brewer. I've heard different things. Doesn't really matter. But the Sons of Liberty were led by him. More about his picture. I'm going to come up to the two pictures on your handout. Now, the tactics they used, one of the common things might be to find a tax collector and pour things down their throat. Now, this wasn't meant to kill you, but it sure as heck made you uncomfortable. They might basically put castor oil in your throat. Now, my grandma, old school, she'd been born in 1898. When people would get sick, her solution, and she used it once on me, was to give me castor oil. Now, when you get castor oil, in large enough amounts, it can kill you, but a little bit will make you start, going to the bathroom, let's say. And the idea was it's supposed to, clean you out, make you feel better. I learned after that, don't ever tell grandma you're sick. I'm perfectly fine. So they're pouring castor oil down this guy's throat. Another thing they might do is if you're an official for the government, they might find and sack your home. By sacking it, they go in, they trash it, they tear it down, they steal your stuff. Well, I don't know about stealing it, but they wreck all the stuff that you have. But perhaps one of the most common, and one of the things you guys have heard the most, is what's called tarring and feathering. Tarring and feathering. Now, the way this works basically, y'all, is the tax official would be caught. They would tear your clothes off or take your clothes off. So you were standing in front of the crowd butt naked. Then they had tar, right? Really, really thick, hot, gooey tar. It's like asphalt kind of stuff. They would pour that on you. Then those people had access to feathers all over. They used feathers for their sheets or for their beds, for their pillows and stuff. They would then pour feathers all onto you. So that's how you were tarred and feathered. If you look at this picture here close up, you can see the guy has already been tarred and feathered. And as if that's not enough, if you look back behind him, you see a noose. They're literally threatening y'all to hang this dude. The Stamp Act itself is turned upside down, and they're going to hang him from the old Liberty Tree. Now, as I've mentioned, the Daughters of Liberty. This is from the TV show John Adams and the series a few years ago. You see them put the feathers on their ears and tar. Now the tar, y'all, can cause some pretty bad burns on your body. It's somewhat hard to breathe with your pores all closed. They put him on a rail, and they're going to take him out of town and drop him off here. Just in tears. Now, when the tar dried and cooled, you could peel it off, but guess what it also took off? Hair and maybe skin. And then you were butt naked out in the middle of nowhere. Obviously, if this happened to you, you were very unlikely to want to be a tax collector. Pretty violent means, and as you can see, John Adams, who would become a big favor of independence, he's sort of the father of independence, he's not real happy with that. To him, that's going too far. There are political ways. There are economic ways that don't use violence. And this is going to be sort of something that you have going on. You've got these more radical types, and then you have these more kind of, less violent types trying to do things. So women, like I said, made homespun, their own homemade cloth. You would definitely want to bring that up if AP asked you about women in the Revolution or before the Revolution. And, they continue to do that during the Revolution, right? Because during the Revolution, the British obviously weren't selling us stuff anymore. Trade with Britain drops to zero during the Revolution. Spinning bees, sewing bees, quilting bees, women making their own cloth, making their own clothes in groups, and that kind of thing. So anyway, y'all, the Sons of Liberty, that was one of the things that they did. Now, the next thing I want to talk about here, y'all, are what are called writs of assistance. Writs of assistance. It's like right without the E, and it's assistance. Now, writs of assistance. You don't need to write all of this, but do write the part here. A writ of assistance. What is it? It's a general search warrant that allowed British officials to search. And so today, y'all, hopefully this never happens. Knock on wood, it hasn't happened to me yet. But if the cops show up at your house and say, let us in, we're here to look for whatever, do you have to let them in? Legally. You might be terrified. Do you have to let them in? No. What do they have to have? They have to have a warrant. What does the warrant have to have on it? Your name, the date, your address, and specifically what they're looking for. They can't just write like illegal stuff. Why do we have that? Because of our experience with writs of assistance. A writ of assistance, y'all, could be given to an entire neighborhood. A British judge might go ahead and write it out, and it allowed the British to come to a neighborhood and to search any house they wanted, and they didn't even have to list what they were looking for. It was a general search warrant. And of course, that is appalling today. Now, admittedly, you guys know if any of you are driving or you're riding around with friends, as a teenager, if you get stopped, what are they likely to do with your vehicle? Search it, right? Happened to me when I was a teenager. This probably happened to you or some of your friends. For whatever reason, and I don't quite understand the legality, it seems like you have less right to say no to a car. Now, what if cops come to your house and there's a dead body on the porch? Can the cops just ignore that and say, okay, we can't do anything. We don't have a warrant. No. If they have probable cause, if they hear somebody screaming, help me, that crazy AP teacher is going to kill me, then they have a right to come on in because they probable cause that there is something there to let them in. But they can't just, let's just go on in and see what's there. And even ever since the 1960s, let's say, even with good faith, a cop decides, hey, I think this person's guilty. I'm going to put a little listening device or a video camera in their house without them knowing it. And I'm going to record their crimes happening. Can that be used in court against them? Nope. You cannot use evidence obtained illegally. Okay? Doesn't matter. The cops have to find some way to get you legally. They can't use illegal things. Supposedly. You and I know there are exceptions and bad stuff sometimes happens. But America, y'all, our Third Amendment, search and seizure, is a direct response to our experiences under the British. Now, the man who thought most about the writs of assistance was James Otis. He was an incredible writer and an incredible lawyer. John Adams said he saw him speaking once, and it was, as he said, as if the man were on fire, his ability. So instead of, that girl is on fire, I guess it could be, that lawyer is on fire. But anyway, y'all, and he comes up with the phrase that people still use today in the legal profession. A man's house, or I guess we could say a woman's house as well now, is his or her castle. You may not think much of it, but they have the right to defend it as a castle would be defended. Unless you have legal means. You got to have a warrant. It's got to list specifically what they're looking for. It's got to be signed by a judge for them to be able to do this, okay? He also came up with another phrase that you guys have already heard a couple times today. Taxation without representation is tyranny. So two very famous phrases, y'all, that people still use today when protesting, right? You know, defending their homes from illegal search and seizure, or when protesting, and I've got two T's in representation, sorry about that. Taxation without representation is tyranny. So these are James Otis's words for it. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the Sons of Liberty here. Now, in this picture here, we see a painting that's actually on my, it's part of Academic Decathlon this year. It's one of the pieces of art that we have to study. Now, this is a painting of probably the most famous member of the Sons of Liberty, and this is Paul Revere. Now, you and I know Paul Revere from his midnight ride, warning people about the British soldiers coming. But that was one night in his life. What did he do the other several thousand nights? Well, he worked as an engraver and as a silversmith. That was his job. In fact, if you can ever find any real Revere ware, real Revere silver, it is worth a fortune. Now, this painting was done by one of America's greatest painters, and I've seen the original. The original's a little bit smaller, if I remember right, but this is an interesting painting because most painters, y'all, only painted the wealthy, people who could afford to hire them to do it. But this is a painting of a craftsman. He's wearing simple clothes here. He's got his work vest on, and it's almost as if we've interrupted him. He's looking directly at us. In his hand, he's holding a silver tea kettle that probably he made. Now, it hasn't been engraved yet. It doesn't have any engraving. But if we look, what's here on the table that also shows his reflection, I tell y'all, one of the coolest things seeing this painting was to come up close to it and see how he'd been able to paint the reflection on this polished table. But also, here are his engraving tools. So it's like we caught the dude in the middle of his job. And this is the only painting we really have of Paul Revere, who was really not that famous in his lifetime, but would later become famous, of course, for the Midnight Ride and when they wrote the poem about it. Now, so I was up in Boston where I went to see this painting and lots of other cool paintings there. And I'm like, man, it seems like I've seen that picture of Paul Revere on some bottle or something. What could it, oh my gosh, it's on there. But of course the deal is, y'all, is that Paul Revere? Is that Sam Adams? Is it Paul Revere? Or is it Jack Black? Did you see that? Is it Paul Revere or is it Jack Black? I'll see. I'll let you guys go. Take care. Appreciate your attention.